Psychology of Crowds author Gustave Le Bon. Who is Gustave Le Bon? He is, first and foremost, the founder of crowd psychology. He was born in the Normandy region in 1841, and he died in Paris at the age of 1931. He wrote in many scientific fields and branches, and, according to most specialists, he wrote the book Crowd Psychology. It is one of his most famous books ever, and it is the one that gave him a high position in the world of thought and knowledge. Most international researchers subsequently relied on this book in order to study the phenomenon of the masses. Introduction only a century ago, it was the traditional policies of countries and the ongoing competitions between rulers that constituted the basic factors in moving events. The opinion of the masses, for the most part, had no value. Today, we notice that the political traditions, individual orientations of kings and rulers, and the rivalries that exist between them. It affects the course of events only slightly, and the voice of the masses has become dominant, as it is what dictates the actions of kings, and the fate of nations is no longer decided in the councils of rulers, but rather in the spirit of the masses. General characteristics, masses, psychological law of their mental unity. In its ordinary sense, the word audience means the gathering of a group, not the appointment of individuals, whereas their national identity, profession, or gender. Whatever coincidence brought them together. But the term audience takes on a completely different meaning from the psychological point of view, and only in these circumstances can a group of people possess new characteristics that are very different from the characteristics of each individual that constitutes it. Then the conscious personality of the individual is obliterated, and the emotions and thoughts of the many units that make up the crowd become directed at the same person. Direction, and then a collective spirit is formed. Transient and temporary, no doubt, but it has specific and completely crystallized characteristics. There are many reasons that control the emergence of the characteristics of crowds, the first of which is that the individual included in the crowd only through the gathered number acquires an overwhelming feeling of power, and this is what allows him to submit to some instincts. Were it not for this feeling, he would not have obeyed, and he does so willingly, because the public is foolish by nature. Hence, small responsible. Since the sense of responsibility is what deters individuals, it completely disappears in such a case. In order to understand this phenomenon, we must have some information about the latest recent discoveries of physiology. We know today that an individual can be placed in a certain state in which he loses his conscious personality, and thus he is subject to all the suggestions of the surgeon who makes him lose it. And then Akbar commits acts that are contrary to his true nature, habits, and members of the public who have a very strong personality that enables them to resist Moharrid. They are few in number. So the current sweeps him away with it. Here is a set of basic tips for the individual involved in the audience, the fading of the conscious personality. The dominance of the personality, unconsciously, directs everyone within the same line through incitement and infection of emotions and thoughts, the tendency to transform the incited thoughts into direct action and practice, and thus the individual is no longer himself, but rather becomes an automaton, whose will is no longer able to guide him. This means that once an individual joins the ranks of the masses, he descends many rungs on the ladder of civilization. When he is an isolated individual, he may be an educated, rational person, but as soon as he joins the crowd, he becomes led by his instinct, and thus barbaric by the crowd's emotions and morals. The basic characteristics of the masses, the speed, agility, and impulsiveness of the masses. We can determine the physiology of this phenomenon by saying that the isolated individual possesses competence and competence to control these reactions, while the audience does not have it, so nothing is deliberate with the masses. They can experience all kinds of emotions, and move from one extreme to the other with lightning speed, under the influence of the prevailing instigator at the moment they are experiencing. Secondly, the speed at which the masses are influenced, gullible, and believe anything. The audience is constantly straying on the borders of the unconscious, and willingly receives. all suggestions and orders, and it is expected that the exaggerations and distortions that our audience inflicts on an event that it personally witnesses will be very numerous and with multiple meanings, because the people who make up the audience have very different and diverse natures, but the reality is completely different, because due to infection, these distortions it is of one nature, and with whom? One for each. Members of the group. The first distortion one of them notices constitutes the nucleus of contagious incitement. Third, the emotions of the masses are amplified and simplified. The emotions expressed by the masses, whether good or evil, have a dual character, in the sense that they are both greatly exaggerated and greatly simplified. The simplicity and amplification of the masses' emotions protects them from the torment of doubts and uncertainty, for the masses are like women. It goes directly towards extremism. As soon as the thought appears, it turns into an undoubted certainty, and the simple feeling of aversion to something, or disapproval of it, remains at its normal size for the average person, but it turns directly into raging hatred for the individual involved in crowd and violence. Crowd emotions. It becomes exaggerated among heterogeneous audiences due to a lack of responsibility, and becomes self-confident and reassured that they will not be punished. He is stronger the larger the number of the audience, because this makes him feel the increase in his authority, and this is what makes the gathered masses capable of performing actions that a single individual cannot do. Fourth, the fanaticism of the masses and the tyranny and complacency of their conservatism. Since the public does not doubt for a moment what it believes to be true or false, and since it is fully aware of the size of its power, its tyranny appears to be the size of its fanaticism. If the individual accepts objection and discussion, the public will never tolerate it. For the masses, tyranny and fanaticism are very clear emotions, and they tolerate them with the same ease as they exercise them, as they respect force and are not inclined to respect kindness, which she considers a form of weakness, and her emotions were never directed towards the compassionate and kind-hearted leaders, but rather towards the tyrants who controlled her with strength and power, and these memorials are only erected for them, ideas, rational arguments, the imagination of the masses, the ideas of the masses. Where are the ideas that inspire the masses, or instigate it? It can only become dominant on the condition that it takes a very simple form, and you embody in them in the form of images the mental arguments of the masses. We cannot say absolutely that the masses cannot be influenced by rational arguments, but the arguments that you use, and those that influence them, but the arguments that you use, and those that influence them, appear from the point of view the logic is very low, to the point that we cannot describe it as rational except through analogy and analogy. The weakness of some of the speeches that exerted an influence on the listeners sometimes surprises us when we read them, but we forget that they were written in order to mobilize the masses, and not in order for the imagination of the masses or the imagination of the masses to be read by philosophers. The imagination of the masses, like the imagination of all beings who do not think rationally, is susceptible to being deeply affected by the images that a character, an event of water, or an accident arouse in their souls. It has the same vitality and power as real things themselves. Since the masses are incapable of thinking except through images, they cannot be attracted and influenced except through images, and only the latter terrify or attract them and become an incentive for action and practice. We conclude from this that it is not the facts themselves that influence the popular imagination, but rather the way in which these facts present the opinions and beliefs of the masses. The factors that determine the opinions and beliefs of the masses are of two types: distant factors and proximate or direct factors. Among the distant factors, there are general factors that we find deep within the beliefs and opinions of the masses, such as race, for example, inherited traditions, time, institutions, upbringing, and education. Firstly, inherited traditions. Traditions represent the ideas, needs, and emotions of the past. They represent the essence of the race, and they press with all their weight on us. The true leaders of peoples are their inherited traditions. No civilization can To exist without traditions, that is, without the spirit of nationalism. Secondly, time. Time is the one that cooks the opinions and beliefs of the masses on its slow fire, meaning that it prepares the ground on which they will emerge and sprout. We conclude from this that some ideas that can be achieved in one period seem impossible in another period. Time monitors the very numerous remains of beliefs and ideas, and on their basis the ideas of an era are born. These ideas do not grow by chance or through adventure, but rather we find their roots going deep into a long past. When it blooms, time has prepared the way for it to blossom. Third, education and upbringing. In order to understand the ideas and beliefs that are planted today and will blossom tomorrow, we must understand how the process of preparing and paving the land took place. The education provided to the youth of a country allows us to anticipate the fate and future of this country, and raising the current generation justifies all prevailing expectations and fears. With education and upbringing, the improvement or deterioration of the public spirit is partly responsible for this, the direct factors that contribute to the formation of the opinions of the masses. First, images, words, phrases, or slogans. When we studied the imagination of the masses, we saw that they are particularly affected by images, and if we do not have images, it is possible to stimulate them in the imagination of the masses through the intelligent and correct use of appropriate words and phrases. The power of words is linked to the images they evoke, and is completely independent of their true meanings. Words whose meanings are difficult to determine precisely are those that sometimes have the greatest potential for influence and action. We give examples of the following words: democracy, socialism, equality, freedom, etc. Secondly, experience. Experience constitutes almost the only effective method for firmly implanting the truth in the soul of the masses and destroying illusions that have become too dangerous. But it should be circulated on the widest level, repeatedly and repeatedly, in order to reach the best result. In general, the experiences that one generation lived are useless for the next generation, and for this reason, historical events that usually serve as examples of advice and proof are of no use. Third, the mind. We can excuse ourselves from mentioning the mind if we enumerate the factors capable of influencing the spirit of the masses. But we will talk about it as a negative factor for you, a positive factor in influence. We have proven that the masses are not affected by the needs of rationality and only understand the odd or silver connections between ideas. For this reason, the masses movers and preachers never turn to their reason, but rather to their emotions. The laws of rational logic have no effect on it. People of logic who are accustomed to a series of relatively strict rational arguments cannot refrain from using this type of persuasion when they address the masses, and they are always surprised and astonished, because their words do not resonate with the masses, the motive of the masses, and the means of persuasion that they possess. Mass drive. The leader plays a huge role for the fans. His will represents the nucleus around which opinions gather and fuse. Leaders are not often men of thought, nor can they be, but rather men of practice and engagement, and they are little far-sighted, and peoples have never lacked leaders in history, but they do not all possess those strong convictions that make messengers. These leaders are often orators. Skilled, they only think about their personal interests. They try to convince the masses by appealing to instincts, posture, and other actions used by movers or leaders. Confirmation, repetition, contagion. When it comes to leading a crowd for a specific moment and urging it to commit an act, such as looting a palace or defending a barricade, and being subjected to massacre because of it, we must influence it by means of quick instigators, and the most effective and influential person is the model and example as well. When we want to slowly introduce ideas and beliefs into the soul of the masses, such as introducing modern social theories, for example, we find that the leaders' methods differ. They mainly resort to the following three methods: emphasis, repetition method, contagion method, and personal prestige. If opinions spread through confirmation, repetition, and infection have great power, it is because they possess that secret power called prestige or respect. And all the dominant ideas or people in the world have imposed themselves essentially through the power expressed by the word prestige, classifying and studying the different categories of the masses. The different categories of masses that we can find in each people can be divided in the following way. First, heterogeneous masses, and they are divided into foolish masses, such as street masses, for example, and non-ignorant masses, so that juries and parliamentary councils come to the end. Secondly, homogeneous masses divided into sects, political sects, religious sects, etc. groups, a military group, a priestly group, a workers' group, etc. classes, the bourgeois class, the peasant class, etc. the heterogeneous masses. These groupings are those that we studied its characteristics previously, and it is composed of individuals, not of appointment, regardless of their profession or intelligence. Homogeneous masses include sects, cliques, and classes. The sect constitutes the first stage of the formation of homogeneous masses, as it contains individuals from very different cultures, professions, and circles sometimes, and there is no single bond between them except belief and faith. As for cliques, they only include individuals of the same profession, and therefore with almost similar upbringing and backgrounds. As for the class, it is composed of individuals with different origins who are united not through their sharing of beliefs like members of a sect, and not through their sharing of professional interests like members of a clique, but rather through some interests, some life habits and education similar to the electoral masses. The electoral masses, that is, the groups called upon to vote, those responsible for certain positions and positions, they form heterogeneous masses, the characteristics of which are particularly evident: weak capacity for rational thinking, lack of a critical spirit, impulsiveness, quickness of anger, naivety, and quickness to believe. We also find in their decisions the influence of the driving leaders and the role of the factors that we mentioned previously, such as emphasis and repetition, personal prestige, and contagion. We will not first search for how to tempt these masses. By studying these processes and methods that succeed in tempting them more, we can better deduce their psychology. The first quality that a candidate for elections should possess is personal prestige. Personal prestige cannot be compensated for by anything else except through revolution and wealth. However, possessing the quality of personal prestige is not enough to guarantee the success of the candidate, as the voter wants the candidate to flatter his desires and ambitions. The candidate should shower him with fawning and flattery, and he should not hesitate to distribute the biggest promises to him. The candidate's written program should not be too precise or too definitive, because his opponents can confront him with it later. Likewise, his oral program should not be extremist or exaggerated more than it might be, and of course he can win back his voters with huge reforms without any fear of that. These exaggerated promises have huge effects on voters at the moment, and they are not obligated to adhere to them after their success. The voter never cares later about verifying whether the candidate has committed to implementing his promises or not. Rather, he completely forgets that, even though the elections are held. The parliamentary councils decided on the basis of these programs and promises. The parliamentary system sums up, in fact, the ideal of all modern civilized peoples. It embodies the psychologically incorrect but generally upside-down idea that a large group of people is more capable than a small number of people to make a wise and independent decision on a specific issue. We find in parliamentary assemblies the general characteristics of the masses, middle books on ideas. And the temper, the quickness of anger, the tendency to incitement, the exaggeration of emotions, and the overwhelming influence of the movers and leaders, but because of their special composition, the parliamentary masses show some characteristics that are different from the rest of the masses. Also, if parliamentary assemblies reach a certain degree of formality, they become similar to the ordinary, heterogeneous masses, and therefore their emotions are always characterized by extremism. Sometimes we find them performing heroic deeds, and at other times committing the most heinous deeds. The individual then ceases to be himself and votes on decisions that conflict most with his personal interests.